They laughed when she buried her meat in the ground. Amos Higginson stood behind the counter of his general store, his gray beard catching the October light through the dusty window. The two missing fingers on his left hand were souvenirs from a blizzard in '79, and he wore that loss like a badge of honor. 11 Montana winters had taught him everything he needed to know about survival, or so he believed. His voice carried across the wooden floorboards, past the barrels of flour and the dwindling sacks of salt, loud enough for every customer in the store to hear. A widow cannot salt cure enough meat to matter. That Norwegian hole will not keep those children fed past Christmas. You will be begging scraps from my store before the year turns, if you are still breathing to beg. The other customers shifted their weight. Some nodded in agreement. Two cattlemen on the porch let out low chuckles that floated through the open door like smoke from a dying fire. She stood at the counter with 8 pounds of salt wrapped in brown paper. 8 pounds. Enough to preserve maybe 100 pounds of beef. She needed 400. Her name was Ragna Torstad. She was 32 years old. Her husband had been dead for 6 weeks. She had 3 children under 10, $14 to her name, and a memory of something her father had built in Norway 30 years ago. That memory was all she had left. On January 9th, 1887, a blizzard would drop 16 inches of snow while temperatures plunged to 46 degrees below zero. The worst winter in recorded Montana history was coming, and no one in that store knew it yet. But 5 months from now, and when every other family in the Judith Basin had lost their meat to a warm wind called a Chinook, Ragna Torstad would be the only person with food that had not spoiled. This is the story of how a widow proved that the knowledge passed down through generations can be worth more than all the experience in the world. And it begins with a letter that arrived too late. The letter came in August, carried by a rider from Fort Benton who charged 50 cents for the delivery. Rana's sister in Minnesota wanted to know if Leaf was recovering from the fever. Leaf had been dead for 6 days. She stood in the doorway of the cabin, the paper trembling in her hands. The morning sun fell warm across the threshold. Somewhere behind the barns she could hear Halvor's voice, 9 years old and trying so hard to sound like his father. Inker telling his sisters to be careful near the creek. The words on the page blurred. She read them twice, then folded the letter without reading them again. She placed it in the cedar box where she kept her marriage certificate and the children's baptismal records. The box smelled like her mother's house in Telemark, like another life, like a place she would never see again. She would answer the letter eventually. First, she had to dig a grave in ground that fought the shovel like a living thing. Then she had to figure out how to keep 3 children alive through a Montana winter without the man who had promised to do it with her. The homestead sat 12 miles from Utica along Arrow Creek. 160 acres of bunch grass and sage that Leaf had claimed in 1883. He had chosen this land because the creek meant water, and water meant survival. He had chosen it because the north-facing slope behind the cabin reminded him of home. She wondered now if he had known something. If somewhere in his mind, he had been planning for a winter like this. Planning for the day when the old ways might matter again. The cabin had 2 rooms. The sod roof leaked when the snow melted too fast. The root cellar stayed cool enough for potatoes, but nowhere near cold enough for meat. They owned 1 draft horse named Burn, patient and steady, the kind of horse that never spooked even when wolves howled close in the night. They owned 4 milk cows that would need to be reduced to 2 before winter because Rana could not feed all of them through the cold months. They owned 12 chickens that produced fewer eggs every week. And they owned the contents of Leaf's pockets when he died. $14.37. Rana counted the coins twice, spreading them across the kitchen table in the lamplight while the children slept. Then she started making lists. A family of 4 needed roughly 2 pounds of meat per person per day to maintain strength through a Montana winter. 5 months of cold, maybe 6 if the spring came late. 4 people, 2 pounds, 150 days, 1,200 pounds of meat. She crossed out the number and wrote a more realistic one, 400 pounds minimum. They could supplement with flour, dried beans, whatever vegetables she could store. But without meat, the children would weaken. Without meat, she would weaken, and weakness killed faster than cold on the frontier. 400 pounds of preserved meat required 28 pounds of salt. She had the money for perhaps $5 worth. The supply train from Billings was supposed to come before the snow flew. The railroad kept promising, but promises meant nothing in Montana. The only thing that mattered was what you held in your hands. When she rode the 12 miles to Utica in late October, Higginson's store had a hand-lettered sign in the window. Salt limited, 2 pounds per family until next shipment. She stood at the counter and made her request. 30 pounds of salt on credit against her spring egg production. She would have hens laying by April. She would pay him back double. Higginson shook his head. Not unkindly, but with the certainty of a man who had paid for his experience in flesh and bone. Cannot do it. I extend you 30, and I have got nothing left for the Hendricks family, nothing for the Petersons, nothing for old Sven Gustafson up north. Cannot favor one family over another. Then give me what you can. He measured out 8 pounds and wrapped it in brown paper. That is your share, same as everyone else. She did not argue. There was no point in arguing with a man who had already made up his mind. Mr. Higginson, my husband is dead. I have 3 children. The oldest is 9. If you could see your way to... I know your situation, Mrs. Torstad. His voice was not cruel, just tired. The voice of a man who had delivered bad news before and would deliver it again before winter was done. Everyone knows it. That is why I'm giving you the same share as everyone else instead of less. He slid the package across the counter. Then he leaned forward, lowering his voice as if sharing a confidence that cost him nothing to give. Can I give you some advice? Free of charge. She waited. Sell the claim. Take the children to Helena or Great Falls. Find a family that can take you in, or find a new husband who can provide. He glanced toward the window, toward the mountains where winter was already gathering like an army preparing to march. Leaf was the one who knew what he was doing out here. You are a woman alone with 3 young ones and winter coming. There is no shame in knowing when you are beat. Ragna picked up the salt. How much do I owe you? 80 cents. She paid him and turned to leave. Mrs. Torstad. She stopped at the door. His voice carried across the empty store. She knew that by sundown, every person in Utica would know exactly what he had said. That was how things worked in small towns. Words traveled faster than horses. A widow cannot salt cure enough meat to matter, and that Norwegian hole in the ground will not keep those children fed past Christmas. You will be begging scraps from my store before the year turns, if you are still breathing to beg. She walked out into the October sunshine. She did not look back. The Norwegian hole was not a secret. She had mentioned it once, weeks earlier, to Eliza Hendricks, her nearest neighbor 3 miles east. A passing comment about how her father had stored fish in Telemark. Just a memory, shared over coffee. 2 women talking about the places they had left behind. Eliza had mentioned it to her husband, Silas. Silas had mentioned it at Higginson's store, and word traveled fast when there was nothing else to talk about. The Norwegian widow was going to dig a hole and put her meat in it. Like burying treasure, like hiding from the cold, like something from the old country that had no place in Montana. She heard the laughter when she collected her horse from the hitching post. 2 cattlemen on the store's porch. One of them worked for Thaddeus Caldwell, the biggest rancher in the Basin. The other was young, barely 20, with the kind of smirk that came from never having buried a husband or worried about feeding children through winter. She did not acknowledge them. She mounted Byrne, tucked the 8 pounds of salt into her saddlebag, and began the 12-mile ride home. 6 weeks until hard freeze. 8 pounds of salt to preserve 100 pounds of meat, and a memory of her father's ice cellar that might be nothing more than a child's misunderstanding of something she had seen 30 years ago. 5,000 miles away, in a country she would never see again. The cattleman's laughter followed her out of town. The root cellar beneath the cabin stayed cool in summer. 50 degrees, perhaps 55. Good enough to keep potatoes from sprouting, milk from souring too fast, butter from melting into yellow pools. Not good enough for meat. Ragna descended the ladder with a candle and stood in the earthen chamber, trying to remember. She had been 6 years old, perhaps 7. Her father, Eric Halverson, traded fish along the Telemark coast, salmon from the rivers, cod from the sea. He needed to store his catch for weeks, sometimes months, before transport to market. And he had built something, a structure dug into the hillside behind their house. She remembered the cold breath that spilled out when he opened the door, a gasp of winter air in the middle of July. She remembered the way her skin prickled, the way her breath turned to mist, even as the summer sun beat down on the grass outside. She remembered eating salmon that tasted fresh, not salted, not smoked, fresh as if it had been caught that morning. The ice cellar, the Cellar. Her father had explained it once, when she asked why the fish did not rot. The ice holds the cold, he had said. His voice was patient. His hands were rough from the nets. The straw holds the ice. The earth holds everything. She had not thought about it in years. There had been no need. In Minnesota, salt was cheap and plentiful. In Montana, Eliza had handled the preservation. Now she stood in a root cellar that could not keep meat frozen and tried to reconstruct a technology from fragments of childhood memory. What had the Cellar looked like? Deep, deeper than this cellar. Her father's had been dug into a north-facing slope, horizontal rather than straight down. Easier to excavate, kept the warm southern sun off the entrance. The walls had been stone. She thought she remembered that. Double walls with a gap between them. The gap filled with straw or sawdust. The floor was gravel or wooden planks, something that let meltwater drain away from the ice. And the ice itself, great blocks of it, harvested from the frozen river in January, packed into the chamber layer upon layer, insulated with straw, lasting through spring and summer and into the following autumn. A massive thermal battery that held cold the way a stone holds heat after the fire dies. Could she build one here? The north slope behind the cabin faced away from the sun. The soil was rocky but workable. Arrow Creek froze solid every winter. She had seen the ice fishermen on it in January. The ice grew thick enough to support men and horses, thick enough to cut. She began calculating. Dig a chamber 10 feet deep, 8 feet wide, 10 feet long. Line it with fieldstone from the creek. Build double walls and fill the gap with straw from the barn. Install a gravel floor with wooden planking above to keep the ice off the drainage. Cover everything with a sod roof and heavy door. Harvest ice in January. Cut blocks from Arrow Creek, 22 inches square, 12 to 16 inches thick, 200 pounds each. Stack them in the chamber. Pack the floor and walls with ice. Layer in the meat. Cover with straw to trap the cold. The ice mass would maintain freezing temperatures long after the surface warmed. The double wall insulation would slow heat transfer. The depth would protect against temperature swings. Even a Chinook, the warm wind that swept down from the Rockies, melting snow in hours, fooling you into thinking spring had come, even that would barely register 10 feet underground. She climbed out of the root cellar and walked to the north slope behind the cabin. The ground was hard with autumn chill, but not yet frozen. She could dig. She would have to dig. If she was wrong, if the cellar did not work, if Montana was too different from Norway, if she had misremembered everything, her children would starve. If she was right, they would live. She went to the barn, retrieved the pickaxe, and started breaking ground. Odin found her on the second day. The dog had belonged to Leif, a Norwegian elkhound with silver-gray fur and eyes that seemed to understand more than any animal should. He had lain beside Leif's grave for 3 days after the burial, refusing food, refusing water, refusing to move even when Halvor begged him with tears streaming down his face. On the 4th day, he had risen, shaken himself, and walked to the cabin door. He had not left the children's side since. But on the 2nd day of digging, while Ragna swung the pickaxe into rocky subsoil, Odin appeared at the edge of the excavation. He sat down to watch. He stayed there all day. When strangers approached, his ears would perk up, and a low growl would rumble in his chest. When the children came to bring water, his tail would thump against the ground. When Ragna paused to rest, her shoulders burning, her hands blistering, he would press his nose against her palm, as if to say he understood what she was doing, even if no one else did. She spoke to him sometimes, in Norwegian, the language of her childhood, the language of her father's house, where she had learned things that no one in Montana seemed to remember. Odin's ears twitched at the sound of her voice. He did not understand the words, but he understood the tone, determination, stubbornness. The same tone Leif had used when he refused to give up on anything. She looked at the hole she had dug. 3 feet deep, 7 more to go. We will make it, she told the dog. We have to. Pause for reflection. Before we continue, I want you to think about something. Ragna is standing in a hole she has dug with her own hands, 3 feet deep, with 7 more feet to go. She has blisters on her palms that have broken open and bled through the rags she wrapped them in. Her husband is 6 weeks dead. Her children are sleeping in a cabin with a leaky roof. Winter is coming, and everyone in town has already decided she will fail. But she has something they do not have. She has knowledge, passed down from her father, who learned it from his father, who learned it from generations of Norwegians who survived winters that would kill everyone in Montana. The question is not whether the ice cellar will work. The question is whether she will live long enough to finish it. Eliza Hendricks arrived on the 3rd day. She appeared at the edge of the excavation, her skirts dusty from the ride, her face creased with genuine worry. Ragna. What are you doing? Ragna did not stop swinging the pickaxe. Building an ice cellar. That is what Silas said. I did not believe him. Eliza climbed down into the pit, her boots sinking into the loose dirt. Ragna, this is madness. A root cellar cannot keep meat frozen. Everyone knows that. This is not a root cellar. Ragna struck stone. The impact rang through her arms like a bell. It is deeper. Different construction. In Norway. Eliza said it like a doctor naming a disease. Ragna, this is Montana. It is different here. Cold is cold. But the work. Eliza gestured at the pit, at the pickaxe, at Ragna's raw hands wrapped in bloody rags. You are going to work yourself to death for nothing. And then what happens to Halvor and Ingrid and little Astrid? Ragna finally stopped. She leaned on the pickaxe and met her neighbor's eyes. Her voice was steady, but something underneath it made Eliza take a step back. What is my alternative, Eliza? I have 8 pounds of salt. That preserves 100 pounds of meat. I need 400 to keep my children alive until spring. The salt is gone. The supply train is not coming. No one will sell me more. You could buy preserved meat. With what money? I have $14. We could share. Silas and I. We will have extra probably. You have 4 children. You will not have extra. Eliza fell silent. They both knew it was true. So I dig. Ragna raised the pickaxe again. I build what my father built. And maybe it works and my children live. Or maybe it does not and they die. She swung. The blade bit into stone with a sound like breaking bones. But they will certainly die if I do nothing. This is the only thing I can do. Eliza climbed out of the pit. She stood at the edge, looking down with something that might have been pity, or might have been the first stirring of respect. I hope you are right. I truly do. But if you are not, come to us before it is too late. She paused. Please. She walked away across the autumn grass. Ragna watched her go. Then she raised the pickaxe and swung again. The skeptics came in waves. First came the curious, the ones who had heard the rumors at Higginson's store and wanted to see for themselves. They stood at the edge of the excavation and asked questions that were not really questions. Is that hole supposed to keep meat cold? You know, root cellars do not freeze, right? My grandfather tried something like this in Wisconsin. Did not work. Ragna did not argue. She did not explain. She simply kept digging. The blacksmith's wife came on the 5th day. Prudence Olsen did not climb down into the pit. She stood at the edge with her arms crossed, her bonnet pulled tight against the October wind. She did not speak to Ragna directly. She spoke loudly enough for Ragna to hear. Poor thing. The grief has taken her sense. Someone should write to her family in Minnesota. Let them know she needs help. Her husband stood beside her, a big man with hands like shovels. He said nothing. He never said much of anything, but he nodded. They watched for perhaps 10 minutes. Ragna could feel their eyes on her back as she swung the pickaxe, feel the weight of their judgment pressing down like the October sky. Then they left. She heard the words repeated later, at Higginson's store, at the church, in the hushed tones that women used when they talked about other women who had stepped outside the lines. The Norwegian widow has lost her mind. She is digging her own grave. Ragna kept digging. Graves were 6 feet deep. Her ice cellar would be 10. Reverend Josiah Crane arrived on the 7th day. His black coat was dusty from the ride. His Bible was tucked under his arm. His face wore the expression of a man who had come to save a soul, whether the soul wanted saving or not. Mrs. Torstad, I understand you are digging. Ragna did not stop her work. Perhaps you should spend more time in prayer and less time digging like a mole. The Lord provides for those who trust in him. The Lord gave my father knowledge. She swung the pickaxe. Dirt flew. I am using it. The Reverend's face tightened. There is wisdom in accepting help, Mrs. Torstad. There is wisdom in knowing your limitations. Ragna looked up at him. Her face was streaked with dirt. Her hands were wrapped in rags that had once been white. In Telemark, we have a saying, the earth remembers cold longer than the sky forgets it. She turned back to her digging. Perhaps you should spend more time learning from the past and less time telling widows what they cannot do. The Reverend left without another word. Dr. Franklin Mercer came on the 12th day. He was the only physician within 50 miles, Harvard educated. He had come west for his health and stayed because someone had to treat the farmers and ranchers who broke bones and caught fevers and died in ways the textbooks had never described. He was respected. His opinion mattered. He stood at the edge of the pit, looking down at Ragna with the expression of a man evaluating a patient who refused to follow medical advice. Mrs. Torstad, I must advise you, from a scientific standpoint, this is impractical. He clasped his hands behind his back. The human body requires consistent temperature. Meat requires consistent temperature. A hole in the ground cannot provide that. Ragna paused her work. How deep does frost penetrate in Montana, doctor? I do not know the exact figure. In Telemark, frost goes 4 feet deep. 10 feet down, the earth stays 54 degrees year-round. She leaned on the pickaxe. Ice packed properly can last 18 months. Dr. Mercer opened his mouth, closed it. He was not accustomed to being educated by widows covered in dirt. I hope you know what you are doing. He rode away. By evening, everyone in Utica knew that even the doctor thought she was wasting what little time she had left. The young cowboy came with a group of Caldwell's men. Their horses kicked up dust as they rode past the homestead. The leader was Colt Tanner, barely 20 years old. He had a smirk that had never been tested by real hardship. He reined his horse at the edge of the excavation and let out a low whistle. Hey, boys, look at this. The Norwegian widow is digging herself a grave. Laughter from the other riders. The kind of laughter that men use when they want everyone to know they are in on the joke. $5 says she loses everything by February. Who is in? More laughter. Odin rose from his spot near the pit. A low growl built in his chest, his hackles rose. His eyes fixed on the young cowboy with an intensity that made the horse shift nervously. Ragna placed a hand on his head. The dog bared his teeth. Colt Tanner's smirk faltered, just for a moment. Then he laughed again, louder this time, and rode away with his companions. Ragna watched them disappear over the ridge. The laughter faded with the hoof beats. The dust settled back onto the frozen ground. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her hands tightened on the pickaxe handle. The blisters underneath the rags sent fire up her arms. She turned back to the pit and swung. The earth would answer for her, in time. But not everyone laughed. Old Sven Gustafsson appeared one afternoon, a weathered man of 72 who had come from Sweden in his youth. He had settled in Montana before it was even a territory. He had buried 2 wives and a son. His beard was white as snow. His hands were gnarled from decades of work, but his eyes were sharp as winter stars. He stood watching Ragna work for nearly an hour before he spoke. I remember my grandfather's ice house in Dalarna. His voice was rough, accented, the voice of a man who still dreamed in Swedish even after 50 years in America. Double walls, straw between, lasted through July. Ragna looked up, surprised. It was the first time anyone had said anything that was not criticism or concern or thinly veiled mockery. Sven nodded slowly. Yours will work. The girl knows what she is doing. He walked away without another word. That night, for the first time since Leif died, Ragna allowed herself to believe that she might actually succeed. To a pause for reflection. I want you to understand what Ragna was facing. Not just the physical labor, though that was brutal enough. Not just the cold, though Montana winters killed people every year. She was facing something harder than either of those things. She was facing an entire community that had already decided she would fail. Every day she swung that pickaxe, knowing that people were laughing at her. Every night she fell into bed with aching muscles, knowing that tomorrow there would be more laughter, more pity, more advice about selling the claim and finding a new husband. But she kept digging, because she knew something they did not know. She knew that the earth remembers cold longer than the sky forgets it. And she knew that her father had been right about everything else in life, so there was no reason to doubt him now. And the work consumed everything. Ragna woke before dawn and dug until her shoulders burned. She carried stones until her back seized. She mixed straw insulation until her hands cracked and bled from the dry stalks. Halvor helped when he could, 9 years old, still small, but strong enough to haul dirt in the wheelbarrow and fetch tools from the barn. He did not ask questions about the ice cellar. He simply worked alongside his mother with the silent determination of a child who understood more than he should have to understand at his age. Ingrid, 7, carried the smaller stones. She made a game of it, sorting them by size and color, pretending she was building a castle instead of a meat storage room. Even Astrid, only 4, did her part. She brought her mother water from the well. She watched the fire that kept the cabin from freezing while everyone else was outside. She talked to Odin in the serious voice of a child who believed the dog understood every word. The days blurred into one another. 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. Ragna's hands blistered, then calloused, then cracked open again. She wrapped them in rags and kept working. Her body learned to ignore the pain. Her mind learned to focus only on the next stone, the next shovelful of dirt, the next inch of progress. By the time November arrived, she had stopped counting the days. She counted only the depth of the pit, 6 feet, 7 feet, 8. The first hard frost turned the excavation dirt to something like concrete. Digging slowed to half the previous pace, but she did not stop. To burn, the draft horse dragged the largest stones with rope when Ragna could not move them alone. The horse was patient, stolid, unimpressed by the strangeness of his task. On November 27th, she slipped. A whetstone shifted under her boot. Her foot went out. She fell hard against the half-finished wall, left side, ribs striking stone. The pain was immediate and total. She lay in the dirt, gasping, unable to draw a full breath, while 9-year-old Halvor ran screaming from the cabin. "Mama! Mama!" Odin reached her first. He pressed his nose against her face, whining, pawing at her shoulder. His eyes were wild with something that looked like fear. She could not answer. She could only lie there while stars burst behind her eyes and her son's terrified face swam above her. The ribs were bruised, possibly cracked. Every breath hurt. Every movement sent lightning through her left side. She lost 2 days to bed rest. 2 days she could not afford. On the morning of the 3rd day, she rose before dawn. She wrapped her midsection in torn sheets pulled so tight she could barely breathe. She climbed down into the excavation. The pain was extraordinary. She worked through it. Silas Hendricks appeared on November 29th. Eliza had sent him. She is too proud to ask. He said it standing at the edge of the pit. His face was the face of a man who did not want to be there, but could not look at himself in the mirror if he stayed away. But she will work herself to death at this rate. And then what happens to those children? He was a lean man, weathered, skeptical of the project, not afraid to say so. He thought the ice cellar was a fool's errand. He had told Eliza as much. But he had also seen Ragna's children playing in the yard, and he had counted on his fingers how many weeks until spring. "I do not think this contraption will work." He lowered himself into the pit. His boots landed heavily on the packed earth. "But I am not going to watch a neighbor's children starve because their mother killed herself digging." He stayed for 2 days. He installed the wooden floor planking, leveled it, made it strong enough to hold the weight of 4 tons of ice. He built the door frame, heavy timber with leather strap hinges. He showed Ragna how to seal the gaps with mud and straw so no warmth could creep in. On the 2nd evening, Ragna spoke about payment. "I cannot pay you in money, but I have 1 laying hen left. She is young, good producer." Silas looked at the hen, looked at Ragna's gaunt face, looked at the cellar that had cost her everything she had and more. "Keep the hen. You will need the eggs." He climbed out of the pit and gathered his tools. If this works, if by some miracle it works, you will owe me a side of beef next autumn. Fair. Ragna nodded. Fair. Silas paused at his horse. It is well built. I will give you that. The stonework is solid. The insulation is thick enough. He swung into the saddle. Whether it works is between you and God. He rode away toward the east. Ragna watched him go. Then she began fitting the sod roof, layering earth and grass over willow poles, sealing the chamber against the coming cold. Thaddeus Caldwell came 4 days before the cellar was finished. He owned 2,000 head of cattle on 60,000 acres of leased range. He had arrived in Montana in 1880 with capital from a Kansas inheritance and built the largest operation in the Judith Basin. He had done it by knowing when to push and when to wait, by recognizing opportunity when other men saw only obstacles. He wanted more. He always wanted more. He had offered to buy Leif Torstad's claim 6 months before Leif died. Leif had refused. Now Leif was in the ground, and his widow was digging a hole that everyone said would fail. Caldwell rode up on a bay gelding that cost more than Ragna's entire homestead. He sat in the saddle looking down at her as she carried a stone from the creek toward the excavation. Mrs. Torstad, she set the stone down. Her ribs screamed. Mr. Caldwell, I have been hearing about your project. He smiled, but his eyes did not. An ice cellar, they say. Norwegian style. And that is right. I admire your determination. I do. He swung down from the horse and walked to the edge of the pit. He looked at the double walls, the straw insulation, the wooden floor. But I wonder if you have considered your options. All of them. Ragna said nothing. This claim, his voice was smooth, practiced, the voice of a man who had bought many things from desperate people. 160 acres, including a quarter-mile of Arrow Creek frontage. That water access is valuable, very valuable to a man running cattle. I am aware of what the land is worth. Good. He stepped closer. Then you will understand when I tell you I am prepared to offer $200 cash for the property. Right now. Today. $200. Less than half what Leif had paid for the claim. The materials, the stock, the improvements. Less than half what it would cost to rebuild elsewhere. That is a generous offer. Ragna's voice was flat. Given that you expect me to fail anyway. Caldwell's smile tightened. I am a practical man, Mrs. Torstad. I see a widow with 3 children and winter coming. I see a hole in the ground that will not keep anything cold. I see a situation that has only one ending. He spread his hands. I would rather give you something for the land than watch you abandon it for nothing in February. I am not selling. $200. You could start fresh in Helena. Find a new husband. He glanced toward the cabin, toward the children's voices. Those children need a father. Those children have a mother. Ragna's voice did not rise, but something in it made Caldwell take a half step back. This land is their inheritance. My husband is buried here. She met his eyes. We are not leaving. Caldwell studied her for a long moment. His jaw tightened. Then he remounted his horse. Pride will not keep you warm in January, Mrs. Torstad, and it will not feed those children. He gathered the reins. When you change your mind, and you will, you know where to find me. He rode off toward the east, toward his 60,000 acres, his 2,000 head, his certainty that widows always failed. Ragna watched him go. Then she picked up the stone and carried it to the pit. The cellar was finished on December 8th. Ragna stood inside it for the first time, truly inside, beneath the sealed roof with the heavy door closed behind her. The darkness was absolute until she lit the candle. The air was still and cold, but not yet freezing. The earth breathed around her, ancient, patient, indifferent to the struggles of the people who scratched their lives from its surface. The double walls rose solid on all sides. The floor planking held firm beneath her feet. The door sealed tight against the frame. She had done it. She had built what her father had built, a space where cold could be trapped and held, where ice could last through seasons, where meat could be preserved without salt. Now she needed ice, but the ice could not come yet. Arrow Creek would not freeze thick enough until January, 12 inches minimum to support the weight of a woman cutting blocks. 14 inches or more to be safe. She would have to wait. December's cold held. 10 below zero, 20 below, 30 below. One night, when the stars burned like white fire and the air felt like broken glass in her lungs, the thermometer read 42 below. The beef hung frozen in the barn. 800 pounds, give or take, solid as wood, safe as long as the temperature stayed below freezing. She had salt-cured 100 pounds with her 8 pounds of salt. The rest hung in the cold, waiting for the cellar, waiting for the ice. Ragna watched the thermometer Leaf had nailed to the barn wall. She watched the mercury drop and drop and drop, and she watched the sky for any sign of warm wind from the west. Christmas came. Ragna made rice pudding with the last of their sugar. She read from the Norwegian Bible her mother had given her when she left for America. She let the children stay up late by the fire, their faces glowing in the light. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, they were warm, safe, for now. Halvor asked about the ice cellar. When can we fill it? January. Why, when the creek ice is thick enough? Will it work? Ragna looked at her son. 9 years old, his father's eyes, his father's stubborn jaw. The question was not idle curiosity. He understood what was at stake. I believe it will. Papa never built one. Papa used salt. We do not have enough salt. Halvor considered this. His face was serious in the firelight. What if there is not enough ice? What if the creek does not freeze thick? It always freezes thick. Every winter. What if this winter is different? Ragna had no answer. She pulled her son close and held him while the fire crackled, while the wind moaned outside, while 700 pounds of beef hung frozen in the barn, waiting for a cellar that might or might not save them all. On the morning of January 3rd, 1887, Ragna walked to Arrow Creek with a hand axe. She chopped through the surface. The ice was 14 inches thick. Safe enough. She spent the next 3 days in the most brutal labor of her life. The cross-cut saw was 5 feet long. It had belonged to Leif. He had used it to cut timber for the cabin. Ragna used it to cut ice. She marked a grid on the frozen creek with a hand plow, scoring lines 22 inches apart. Then she knelt on the ice, positioned the saw, and began cutting. Vertical strokes, 2 feet deep, following the scored lines. The saw bit into the ice with a grinding shriek that echoed across the frozen valley. Shavings piled around her knees like shattered glass. One cut took 15 minutes. A single block required 4 cuts. The first block broke free at noon. 22 inches square, 14 inches thick, roughly 250 pounds of pure frozen water. Ragna hooked the ice tongs into its surface and heaved. The block did not move. She planted her feet, bent her back, heaved again. Her ribs screamed. Her shoulders burned. Her hands, wrapped in wool mittens, felt like they belonged to someone else. The block shifted, tilted up on one edge. She braced it with her knee, got her shoulder under it, pushed it onto the wooden sled she had dragged to the creek. Burns stood waiting, breath steaming in the frozen air, patient as always. Odin ran circles around them, barking at the ice as if it were an enemy to be defeated. Ragna harnessed the horse to the sled and began the quarter-mile trek back to the cellar. 1 block delivered, 29 more to go. By the end of the first day, she had cut and transported 6 blocks, 1,500 pounds of ice. Her hands were numb despite the wool mittens. Her clothing was soaked from kneeling on the ice, from the spray of the saw, from her own sweat that froze before it could evaporate. She stripped in the barn, changed into dry clothes, stumbled into the cabin. Halvor had kept the fire going. Ingrid had made soup from the last of the salted beef. Astrid was already asleep in the bed the 3 children shared. Mama. Halvor looked at her with wide eyes. Your hands. She looked down. Her knuckles were bleeding through cracked skin. She had not noticed. They are fine. They will heal. She ate the soup without tasting it, climbed into bed, slept like the dead until 4 the next morning. Day 2, 8 more blocks. Day 3, 10 more blocks. On the afternoon of January 5th, Ragna dragged the 30th block of ice into the cellar and collapsed against the wall, shaking. 4 tons of ice, 7,500 pounds, 30 blocks, 250 pounds each, stacked in tight courses along the floor and walls of the chamber. Now the meat. She worked through the evening, transferring beef from the barn to the cellar. Each trip took 15 minutes. Out to the barn, wrestling a frozen quarter carcass onto the sled, dragging it to the cellar, lowering it down the steps. The beef was heavy, awkward, slippery with frost. Her ribs screamed with every lift. By midnight, 500 pounds of beef lay on the ice, wrapped in burlap, layered with straw. She sealed the door. She piled earth against it. She walked back to the cabin on legs that shook with every step. The ice cellar was full. Now she would find out if it worked. Pause for reflection. I want you to understand what Ragna had just accomplished. In 3 days, she had cut and hauled 4 tons of ice, by herself, with a horse and a sled and a saw that was meant for cutting timber. She had done it with cracked ribs, with bleeding hands, with a body that was running on nothing but determination and the memory of her father's voice. And now she had to wait. Wait for the blizzard that was coming. Wait for the Chinook that would come after. Wait to find out if everything she had sacrificed would be enough. The waiting was almost harder than the work. On January 9th, 1887, Ragna woke to silence. Not the ordinary silence of a winter morning. Not the quiet of snow-absorbing sound. This was a deeper silence. A pressure silence. And the kind that came before catastrophe. She opened the cabin door and looked out at a wall of white. The blizzard had begun. Snow fell so thick she could not see the barn 40 feet away. The wind drove it horizontal, piling drifts against everything that stood still. The temperature, which had been 15 below zero when she went to bed, was dropping like a stone thrown down a well. She closed the door and barred it. The children did not go outside that day. Neither did Ragna. She fed the fire, melted snow for water, and listened to the wind shriek around the cabin like a living thing trying to get in. 20 below zero by noon, 30 below by sunset. By the time she put the children to bed, the thermometer read 46 degrees below zero. Cold enough to freeze a man's breath before it left his mouth. Harena, cold enough to turn spit into ice before it hit the ground. Cold enough to kill anything that stayed outside for more than a few minutes. The cabin walls groaned as the wood contracted. The fire in the stove seemed smaller somehow, as if the cold were pressing in from all sides, squeezing the warmth into a tighter and tighter space. Odin lay by the door, ears flat, whining softly. He knew something was wrong. Ragna thought about the ice cellar, 10 feet underground, sealed, insulated, packed with 4 tons of ice and 500 pounds of beef. It would hold. It had to hold. The blizzard lasted 16 hours. When it finally stopped, the drifts around the cabin reached the windowsills. Ragna dug a tunnel to the barn. The animals were alive, Burn stamping and snorting, the 2 remaining cows lowing with hunger. She fed them hay. He broke the ice in their water trough, checked the thermometer on the wall, 46 degrees below zero. She dug a second tunnel to the ice cellar and opened the door. Cold air spilled out like breath from a giant's lungs. She descended the steps with a candle and examined the interior. The ice was solid. The meat was frozen. The straw insulation looked undisturbed by the feel of the air, by the way her breath hung in a cloud before her face. The temperature was somewhere around 28 degrees, maybe 30, cold enough, frozen enough. The cellar had held through the first test, but a 46 below blizzard was not the real test. Everything froze in 46 below. The barn kept meat frozen. The ground kept meat frozen. A corpse would stay frozen for months in weather like this. The real test would come when the temperature rose. Ragna climbed out of the cellar, sealed the door, and looked up at the clear January sky. Somewhere to the west, beyond the mountains, warm Pacific air was waiting. The rest of January brought more cold, more blizzards, more days when leaving the cabin meant risking death. On January 15th, the temperature dropped to 63 degrees below zero, 63 below. Visibility fell to 50 feet. The world beyond the cabin walls ceased to exist. Ragna burned the kitchen chairs for fuel, then the table, then the spare bed frame. The children slept together in one bed, all 3 of them, their combined body heat the only thing keeping them warm when the fire burned low. Halvor stopped asking about the ice cellar. He stopped asking about anything. He retreated into a silent endurance that frightened Ragna more than any blizzard. 9 years old, with the eyes of an old man who had seen too much winter, she told stories to fill the silence. Stories about Norway, about her father's fishing boats, about the ice cellar that kept fish fresh through summer. She described her mother's kitchen, the bread baking in the stone oven, the smell of cardamom and butter. She talked until her voice grew hoarse, because the alternative was letting the silence win. And then, on February 15th, the wind changed direction. Pause for reflection. February 15th, 1887. The temperature outside has been below zero for over a month. The children have not been outside in weeks. The cabin smells of smoke and unwashed bodies and fear. And then the wind changes. It comes from the west, from the Pacific, from a place where the ocean holds warmth even in the dead of winter. They call it a Chinook, a snow eater, a false spring. For most people in Montana, the Chinook was a miracle, a chance to breathe, a break from the killing cold. But for anyone who had meat hanging in a barn, the Chinook was something else entirely. It was a death sentence. Ragna felt it before she heard it, a pressure shift, a softening in the air. Something that made Odin raise his head and whine, that made the children stir in their sleep, that made the fire in the stove burn differently. She opened the cabin door and stood in the darkness, listening. The wind was coming from the west, warm wind, a Chinook. By dawn, the temperature had risen from 30 below zero to 15 above, a 45-degree swing in 8 hours. By noon, it was 38 degrees. Snow that had stood frozen for months began to melt, dripping from the roof, pooling in the yard, turning the hard-packed paths into mud. The children ran outside for the first time in weeks. They built a snowman from the melting slush. They laughed. They threw snowballs at each other while their mother watched from the doorway. Ragna did not laugh. She was thinking about the beef hanging in every barn within 50 miles. She was thinking about the salt-cured meat in every root cellar. She was thinking about the smoked pork in every smokehouse. All of it thawing, all of it entering the danger zone, 40 degrees and above, the temperature where bacteria bloomed and meat turned deadly. She walked to the ice cellar and opened the door. Cold air poured out. She descended the steps and pressed her hand against the nearest block of ice. Still frozen, still solid. The meat, wrapped in burlap, packed in straw, surrounded by 4 tons of ice 10 feet underground, was still frozen. Outside, the temperature was 40 degrees above zero. Inside the cellar, it was still below freezing. Ragna sat down on the cold floor and began to cry. The tears came silently at first, then in great racking sobs that shook her whole body. She had not cried when Leaf died. She had not cried when Higginson told her she would be begging by Christmas. She had not cried when her ribs cracked or her hands bled or her children looked at her with eyes that asked questions she could not answer. But now, sitting on the frozen floor of the cellar her father had taught her to build, she wept. Because it worked. Because she had been right. Because her children were going to live. And the Chinook held for 3 days. 3 days of temperatures in the high 30s and low 40s. 3 days of snowmelt and mud and premature hope. 3 days of hanging meat thawing in barns across the Judith Basin. Then on February 19th, the warm wind died. The temperature crashed, 45 degrees in 4 hours, from 35 above to 10 below zero. The mud froze into ruts. The meltwater became ice. The briefly warm world turned brutal again, and in barns and root cellars and smokehouses across the settlement, meat that had thawed refroze, but not the same as before. Meat that thawed and refroze developed ice crystals inside the tissue. The crystals destroyed the structure from within. The texture went soft. The color went wrong. The smell came a few days later. But the damage was done the moment the temperature rose above 40 degrees. Everyone lost their meat that week. Everyone except one person. Because 10 feet underground, surrounded by 4 tons of ice, the temperature in Ragna's cellar never rose above freezing. The Chinook might as well have happened on the moon. On February 22nd, Eliza Hendricks appeared at Ragna's door. She looked gaunt, exhausted, afraid. "Our meat has gone bad." Her voice was barely a whisper. The pork, the beef. Silas opened the smokehouse this morning, and the smell. She could not finish. How much? All of it. 300 pounds. Everything we had. Rana pulled her neighbor inside and closed the door against the cold. Sit down. I will make tea. Eliza's hands trembled around the cup. We have flour left. Beans. Maybe 8 weeks' worth if we are careful. She looked up. Her eyes were red. But the children need meat. They are already so thin. And Silas, he will not admit it, but he is weak. He fell yesterday. Just standing up from a chair. Just fell. Rana looked at her neighbor, at the desperation in her eyes. Eliza. Can you keep a secret? They walked to the ice cellar together. Eliza descended the steps and stood in the cold darkness while Ragna lit the candle. My God. The whisper echoed off the stone walls. The ice was still solid. The meat was still frozen. 500 pounds of beef, preserved, protected, untouched by the Chinook that had destroyed everything on the surface. The Norwegian hole. Eliza's voice cracked. It worked. Ragna. It worked. Ragna nodded. How much can you spare? I will pay you back in spring. Whatever you want. Take 20 pounds. It is what I can give right now. Eliza wept. She wept while Ragna cut a portion of frozen beef from the nearest carcass. She wept while they climbed out of the cellar together. She wept all the way back to the cabin, clutching 20 pounds of meat to her chest like a lifeline. Do not tell anyone. Ragna said it at the door. Not yet. I need to think. Eliza nodded. She mounted her horse and rode east toward her own homestead. Ragna watched her go. She had enough meat for perhaps 12 more weeks at careful consumption. 3 months. Long enough to reach spring, probably. But Eliza would not be the last one to come asking. That night Astrid coughed. Rana did not think much of it at first. Children coughed. The cabin was smoky from the fire. The air was dry. But by morning, the cough had deepened, and Astrid was warm to the touch. Fever, congestion, lethargy. The symptoms Ragna had seen before. The symptoms that meant pneumonia. Dr. Mercer came on the second day. He examined Astrid with hands that still trembled from his own ordeal. His supplies had frozen and shattered during the worst of the cold. His medicine cabinet was empty. Keep her warm. Keep her hydrated. Pray. That was all he could offer. He paused at the door. His hat was in his hands. His face was drawn with exhaustion and something that looked like defeat. Mrs. Torstad, if I had medicine, I would give it freely. But my supplies froze and shattered during the Arctic outbreak. I have nothing left. He looked at the floor. You saved my life with your meat. I cannot save your daughters. He left without another word. Ragna did not sleep. She sat beside Astrid's bed for 7 days, changing the cold cloths on her daughter's forehead, spooning broth between cracked lips, telling stories about Norway, about the ice cellar, about grandfather Eric and the fish that stayed fresh through July. Odin lay at the foot of the bed, refusing to move. He had not eaten in 3 days. He watched Astrid with eyes that seemed to understand what was happening. The fever burned. Day 3, day 4, day 5. Rana prayed, in Norwegian, the language of her childhood, the language her mother had used to sing her to sleep. She prayed to a God she was not sure she believed in anymore, asking for one more miracle. She had gotten her ice cellar. She had gotten her meat. Please, she whispered into the darkness. Just one more. Day 6. Astrid's breathing grew shallow. Her skin was dry and hot. She had stopped responding to her name. Halvor sat in the corner, silent, watching. Ingrid cried herself to sleep every night. Day 7. Rana was holding her daughter's hand when she felt it. The fever broke at dawn. It happened slowly at first. A lessening of the heat, a deepening of the breathing, a flicker of movement behind closed eyelids. Then Astrid opened her eyes. Mama? Her voice was weak, barely a whisper. I am hungry. Rana wept for the second time that winter, but these tears were different. Pause for reflection. Astrid opened her eyes and said 4 words. Mama, I am hungry. 4 words. That was all it took. The fever had broken. The danger had passed. The little girl who had burned with sickness for 7 days was going to live. But I want you to think about something. In the weeks that followed, more than 15 families would come to Ragna's door. The same families who had laughed at her. the same people who had called her mad, the same neighbors who had bet money that she would fail. They would come with empty hands and empty bellies. They would come asking for the meat that their own methods had failed to preserve. What would you do? Would you help the people who mocked you? The people who told you to sell your land and find a new husband? The people who planned your funeral while you were still alive? Or would you let them learn the cost of their arrogance? Ragna Torstad made her choice, and that choice tells us everything we need to know about who she really was. The visitors came in waves after the fever broke. Word had spread. Eliza had tried to keep the secret, but she had told Silas, and Silas had told someone at what remained of Higginson's store. By the end of February, everyone in the Judith Basin knew the Norwegian widow had meat, frozen meat, preserved meat, meat that had survived the Chinook when nothing else had. They came one by one. Silas Hendricks came first, hat in hand, his face a mask of shame. "I called you a fool." His voice was rough, broken, the voice of a man who had not slept in days. "I helped you build that cellar because I thought you were going to die. I wanted to be able to tell myself that I had tried, that when your children starved, it was not because I did nothing." He stepped toward the frozen beef, reached out and touched the solid ice wall with his bare hand. His fingers came away cold and wet. "I never believed it would work. Not for one moment. Every night Eliza and I talked about you, about how sad it was. About how you were wasting your last strength on a hole in the ground." His voice cracked. "We were planning your funeral, Ragna, in our heads. We were already deciding who would take Halvor, who would take the girls, what would happen to your claim." He turned to face her. His eyes were wet. "And the whole time, you were building the only thing that could save any of us. You knew something we did not know. And instead of listening, we laughed." He took off his hat, held it against his chest. "I was wrong. We were all wrong." He paused. "And you saved us anyway, even after everything we said, everything we did." Ragna looked at him for a long moment. Then she handed him a package wrapped in burlap. 20 pounds of frozen beef. "You helped me build it," she said. "That was not nothing." Silas took the package. He did not try to speak. He could not. He simply nodded and walked away into the cold. Prudence Olsen came next, the woman who had stood at the edge of the pit and spoken loudly enough for Ragna to hear. The woman who had said the grief had taken her sense. The woman who had suggested someone should write to her family in Minnesota. "I know I said terrible things. I know I do not deserve your help." Her voice broke. "But my children, please." Ragna gave her 15 pounds of beef. Colt Tanner came on horseback. His face was pale. His feet were wrapped in rags. He had lost 3 toes to frostbite during the worst of the cold. He did not say anything. He just stood at the edge of the cellar, looking at the ice, looking at the meat, looking at the woman he had mocked and laughed at and bet against. Then he turned and rode away. Ragna never saw the $5 he had wagered. She did not ask for it. Reverend Crane came on a Sunday. His church had collapsed under the weight of the snow. His congregation had scattered. He had spent 3 weeks sleeping in the back room of Higginson's store. "I told you to pray more and dig less." His voice was barely audible. "I told you the Lord would provide." He looked at the ice cellar. "I was wrong. You provided. You and that knowledge your father gave you." He paused. "Perhaps the Lord works through knowledge as well as prayer." Dr. Mercer came last. He stood in the cellar for a long time, not speaking, just looking. His Harvard education had not prepared him for this. His scientific training had told him it was impossible. But there it was. Frozen meat, solid ice, a temperature that had not risen above 30 degrees while the surface world went mad. "From a scientific standpoint," he said slowly, "I was completely wrong." He turned to face Ragna. "I owe you an apology, Mrs. Torstad, and I owe you my life, and I would very much like to understand how this works." Ragna smiled. It was the first time she had smiled in months. The ice holds the cold. The straw holds the ice. The earth holds everything. She sounded exactly like her father. Pause for reflection. In the weeks after the Chinook, more than 15 families came to Ragna's ice cellar. She gave away over 200 pounds of meat. Nearly half of everything she had stored. She could have refused. No one would have blamed her. These were the people who had laughed at her, who had bet against her, who had told her to sell her land and find a new husband. But she did not refuse. When they asked her why, she gave different answers to different people. To some, she said she knew what hunger felt like. To others, she said she knew what it meant to be alone in a Montana winter. But I think the truth was simpler than that. I think she was just a better person than any of them. Spring came slowly that year. The snow melted in patches. The creek ran high with meltwater. The first green shoots of grass appeared in late March. By April, the cattle that had survived, the few hundred head out of thousands, were grazing again. Ragna walked to the ice cellar one last time before the thaw claimed it. The ice had shrunk to perhaps a quarter of its original mass, but it was still there, still cold, still doing its job. She had enough meat left for 3 more weeks. By then, the chickens would be laying. The cows would be producing milk. The worst was over. She had survived. The summer of 1887 brought visitors of a different kind. Silas Hendricks came in June with lumber and questions. "I want to build one. On my land. Can you show me how?" Ragna showed him. Old Sven Gustafsson came in July. "I told you it would work. Now I want one of my own." Ragna showed him too. By the end of the summer, 7 ice cellars stood in the Judith Basin, all built according to Ragna's specifications, all using the double wall insulation she had learned from her father in Telemark. The knowledge that had saved her children was spreading. Amos Higginson never apologized. He never came to the ice cellar. He never asked for meat. He simply continued running his store, selling salt and flour and whatever supplies the railroad brought through. But that spring, he ordered twice as much salt as usual. He never called it insurance, but everyone knew what it was. Thaddeus Caldwell lost 400 head of cattle during the Chinook refreeze, 400 animals that had survived the cold, that had been kept alive by the warm wind that exposed the grass beneath the snow, that had finally gotten something to eat after weeks of starvation. And then the cold came back, and they died. Caldwell never returned to make another offer on Ragna's land. Some men learn, some men just lose. The years passed. Halvor grew up tall and strong. He had his father's hands and his mother's determination. He became a carpenter, and he built ice cellars across Montana and into the Dakotas. Dozens of them, all following his mother's design. When people asked him where he learned the technique, he always gave the same answer. "My mother taught me. Her father taught her." Ingrid married one of the Hendricks boys. Their wedding was held in the spring of 1901 in the rebuilt church, with Reverend Crane presiding. She named her first daughter Ragna. Astrid became a school teacher. She taught children about Norwegian survival techniques until she was 83 years old. She never forgot the stories her mother told her during those long winter nights. She never forgot the fever that almost killed her, or the broth that brought her back, or the dog that refused to leave her side. And Odin. Odin lived 14 years. He grew gray around the muzzle. His steps slowed. His eyes grew cloudy. But he never stopped following Ragna from the cabin to the cellar to the barn. Never stopped lying at the foot of the children's beds. One never stopped growling softly when strangers came too close. When he died on a warm September afternoon in 1898, Halvor dug a grave for him beside the entrance to the ice cellar. He earned his place. Halvor's voice was thick with grief. He was there for every stone, every block of ice, every moment. Ragna stood at the grave for a long time. Her hand rested on the wooden marker Halvor had carved. Then she went back to work. Ragna Torstad lived to see the 20th century. She watched the railroad expand. She watched automobiles appear on roads that had once been wagon trails. She watched the telegraph become the telephone. She watched the world change. But she never left the homestead. She never sold the land that Thaddeus Caldwell had offered $200 for. She never remarried. She never stopped telling stories about Norway, about her father, about the ice cellar that had saved her children's lives. She died in 1912 at the age of 57 in the cabin she had defended through the worst winter in Montana history. They buried her next to Leif, overlooking Arrow Creek, the same creek that had provided the ice that saved her children's lives. The stone says simply, Ragna Torstad, born Telemark, Norway, 1855, died Judith Basin, Montana, 1912. She remembered. In 1978, researchers from Montana State University were conducting an archaeological survey of homestead sites in the Judith Basin. They found the remains of a structure built into a north-facing slope, about 12 miles from Utica along Arrow Creek. The walls were still standing. The double-wall construction was still intact. Yes, the drainage system still functioned. They brought in thermal measuring equipment and discovered something remarkable. Even after nearly a century, the temperature inside the structure remained within 3 degrees of freezing, while surface temperatures varied by more than 100 degrees throughout the year. The same principle is used today in passive solar homes and Arctic research stations. Ragna did not invent anything. She simply remembered what her father taught her. In 1995, the Montana Historical Society placed a marker at the site of the Torstad homestead. It reads, "On this site, in the winter of 1886 to 87, Norwegian immigrant Ragna Torstad constructed an ice cellar using traditional Scandinavian methods. During the worst winter in recorded Montana history, her cellar preserved meat that fed multiple families after conventional preservation methods failed. The Torstad ice cellar stands as evidence that traditional knowledge, passed down through generations, can save lives even in conditions that defeat modern technology." They laughed when she buried her meat in the ground. Amos Higginson laughed. Thaddeus Caldwell laughed. Dr. Mercer shook his head. Reverend Crane suggested more prayer. Colt Tanner bet $5 she would fail. Prudence Olson told everyone the grief had taken her sense. They all had their reasons. They all had their experience. They all thought they knew better than a widow from Norway with nothing but $14 and a memory of her father's voice. But Ragna knew something they did not know. She knew that the earth remembers cold longer than the sky forgets it. She knew that her father had been right about everything else in life, so there was no reason to doubt him now. She knew that knowledge passed down through generations, through centuries, through the hard lessons of survival in places where winter killed the unprepared. That knowledge was worth more than all the experience in Montana. And she was right. When the blizzard came, she was ready. When the Chinook came, she was ready. When everyone else lost their meat and their hope and their certainty, she was ready. Because she remembered. Ragna Torstad never wrote down her methods. She never sought recognition. When people asked how she had known, she always gave the same answer. In Telemark, we learned that the earth remembers cold longer than the sky forgets it. My father taught me. His father taught him. And now I teach you. Knowledge passed down through generations. Survival wisdom that no blizzard could erase. They laughed when she buried her meat in the ground. They stopped laughing in February. If this story moved you, I hope you will share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because there are people in your life right now who are being laughed at. People who are building something that everyone says will fail. People who are holding on to knowledge that the world has forgotten. Maybe they need to hear about Ragna Torstad. Maybe they need to know that sometimes the person everyone laughs at is the only person who knows the truth. They laughed. But in the end, who was still standing?